4:11 a.m., Marion County, Florida. A sheriff's deputy running a routine plate check in a residential driveway made a notation that would change the course of a federal investigation before sunrise. The house at the end of Palmetto Creek Road had called in a disturbance. A young woman, a neighbor reported, had been pulled from her front door in the dark. By the time Deputy Andre Holloway arrived, the driveway was empty. Tire tracks in the soft grass. A screen door hanging open. A cell phone on the welcome mat. He ran the plate from a neighbor's description. A dark blue Ford F-250, extended cab, Florida registration. The query went through the National Crime Information Center at 4:11 and 17 seconds. The return came back at 4:11 and 40 seconds. 23 seconds. The truck was flagged. Not for this call. For something else entirely. The flag belonged to the United States Marshals Service, Southeastern Regional Fugitive Task Force, operating out of Tampa. The notation on the record was brief. It said the vehicle was a subject of interest in a multi-county missing persons inquiry. It gave a task force pager number. It said, "Do not approach. Do not stop. Notify immediately." Deputy Holloway notified immediately. The task force pager activated at 4:26 a.m. By that time, the truck was already moving east on State Road 40. The Marion County dispatcher had eyes on it through a highway camera near Bellevue. The vehicle was not speeding. It was not evading. It was driving in the right lane at 59 miles per hour, doing nothing that would cause any officer who didn't know its history to look twice. That restraint was deliberate. It would later emerge that the truck had been crossing county lines in this way for months, moving at night, observing speed limits, using state roads rather than interstates, carrying nothing that looked extraordinary from the outside. Investigators would later review the highway camera archive for that stretch of State Road 40 and find the truck on it 6 separate times over the prior 10 weeks. 6 times it had passed that camera. 6 times the plate had been visible. And not once had an officer been in position to run it, or had any reason to. What it carried that morning was not nothing. The Marshals Task Force mobilized from 2 staging points simultaneously. A 4-vehicle convoy out of Ocala and a 2-vehicle unit already positioned near the Ocklawaha River basin, 40 miles east of where the initial plate read had occurred. Task Force Commander Supervisory Deputy Renata Solis coordinated both from a mobile command unit on State Road 42. She had been working this inquiry for 11 weeks. She had a name for the truck, a partial history, and 3 outstanding missing persons reports from across the Florida Panhandle that investigators believed were connected to it. She did not yet know there were 6. The chase, if it could be called that, lasted 38 minutes. The truck never accelerated above 68 miles per hour. It took 4 turns that task force analysts later determined were consistent with a pre-planned route to a specific destination. It did not appear the driver knew he was being followed. That assessment would later be debated. At 5:09 a.m., the truck turned off a county road onto an unmarked gravel track through a stand of water oaks and scrub pine. The track ended at a property that had been registered in 2 different names over the previous 14 months. The main structure was a single-story block building, originally a packing facility for a citrus operation that had shut down in the late 1990s. The windows were boarded. The roof had been partially repaired. Satellite imagery from 11 days earlier showed no vehicles present. The property tax records showed no utilities active. Both of those facts turned out to be wrong. When the truck pulled onto the gravel, a perimeter team already had the property's eastern and southern edges. 2 deputies from Marion County and a Marshals Task Force agent were positioned in the tree line with long glass optics, watching the vehicle park behind the building. The driver did not exit immediately. He sat in the cab for 4 minutes. The perimeter team watched him through the glass. He did not use a phone. He did not look around. He appeared to be consulting something, a notebook or a paper of some kind, in his lap. Then he got out, walked to the rear of the building, and went inside through a steel door that had been left unlocked. At 5:21 a.m., a drone launched from the field behind the property's northern fence line. It carried a FLIR thermal imaging array. The operator, Task Force Deputy Marcus Aldecoa, flew it over the roofline at approximately 60 feet, moving east to west. He was looking for heat signatures that would indicate the number of occupants and their locations inside the building. What he found was not what the exterior suggested. The first thermal pass showed 2 warm signatures on the ground floor, consistent with adults moving through the space. One appeared to be seated. One was moving toward the rear of the building. That was consistent with what the team expected: a suspect, and possibly one additional person. The second pass, at 5:31, covered a lower plane, angling the FLIR to catch signatures through the floor. Aldecoa stopped the drone. He brought it back to a hover. He counted. He called Solis on the radio at 5:33 and gave her a number. She asked him to confirm. He confirmed it. 6. 6 warm bodies beneath the ground floor of the building, stationary, clustered in a space that measured approximately 14 feet by 18 feet based on the thermal footprint. The signatures were consistent with adults at rest or sleeping. The floor above them was solid concrete. They had been there long enough that the surrounding soil had absorbed their heat. The thermal differential between the signatures and the surrounding earth was, in Aldecoa's words to Solis, significant. The operational picture changed entirely in the space of 90 seconds. This was no longer a missing persons recovery of one woman. This was not even the 3 cases from the Panhandle that had started the task force inquiry. This was larger, something that had been running for longer than anyone had mapped. Solis requested additional medical resources immediately. She already had 2 paramedic units staged in the field to the north. She requested 4 more. She contacted the on-call physician liaison at Marion County Regional Medical Center at 5:38 and used specific words: multiple adult victims, prolonged confinement, prepare for immediate intake. The physician asked no unnecessary questions. The protocol was clear. At 5:53, the drone made a 3rd pass. The 6 signatures were still present and still stationary. The 7th signature, the suspect, had moved to the ground floor's front room and appeared to have stopped moving. The drone operator noted the heat profile suggested the individual was seated or lying down. Solis gave the breach order at 5:57. 12 agents from the Marshals Task Force, supported by 4 Marion County deputies, moved from the tree lines on 3 sides simultaneously. The steel door at the rear was the primary entry. A secondary team hit the single-boarded window on the south face, which had been retrofitted with a security hinge on the inside. The 3rd team held the north perimeter and the gravel track, sealing the exit route. The entire movement from tree line to breach took 40 seconds. The entry team later said the building was quieter than they expected. No movement. No sound from inside. The loudest thing was the gravel under their boots. The interior of the building showed evidence of extended occupation. The front room had a cot, a portable propane heater, stacked supply containers, and a battery-powered lamp. The rear room, which had been the original packing line floor, was largely empty except for a workbench and a chest freezer that was not plugged in. The kitchen annex, a small room attached to the eastern wall, added sometime in the late 1980s, contained a pantry unit. Floor to ceiling. Plywood shelving. Canned goods, some of them years old, most of them untouched. The shelving unit appeared to be fixed to the wall. It was not fixed to the wall. It was hinged on a steel pivot, professionally installed. Behind it was a reinforced door, padlocked from the outside with a Medico cylinder lock. The door opened downward on a staircase of poured concrete, 6 steps, into a root cellar that the property's original owners had used for citrus cold storage before commercial refrigeration existed. The space had been modified. Ventilation pipes had been run through the floor. A portable chemical toilet had been placed in the corner. Battery lanterns lined a shelf on the east wall. The walls were bare concrete block. The floor was bare concrete. The ventilation pipes produced a low mechanical hum. The entry team agent who first came down the stairs would later note in her report that the lanterns were all off. The space was completely dark when the door opened. The 6 warm signatures were inside. Deputy Holloway, who had followed the task force convoy east after calling in the plate and was now standing in the field with the perimeter unit, would later describe the moment the agents came back through the rear door as the longest 2 minutes of his professional life. He did not go inside. His role was the perimeter. He stayed at the perimeter and he waited. The women were walked out one at a time, through the rear door, across the gravel, into the tree line where the paramedic teams were staged behind portable privacy screens. Each received an initial assessment on site before transport. The medical coordinator on scene, a Marion County EMS supervisor named Patricia Varela, directed triage based on the condition of each individual as she emerged. The federal documentation records 6 adult females. It records the date and time each was cleared from the structure. It records that each received immediate medical evaluation and was transported to Marion County Regional Medical Center in the subsequent 2-hour window. It records no other details about their condition. The women ranged in age from 22 to 28 years old. They had been reported missing at intervals ranging from 12 days to 40 days before the morning of their recovery. 3 were residents of Gainesville. 1 was from Lake City. 2 were from towns in Alabama, Tuscaloosa and Anniston, respectively. Each had been the subject of a missing persons report. 2 of the Gainesville cases had been cross-referenced by the task force before that night. The Alabama cases had not yet been connected. The Lake City case had been open for 40 days and was the oldest of the 6. The woman from Lake City was the first one through the rear door at 6:14 a.m. Her name in the federal record is redacted. Her family, investigators noted, had been contacted by a Marion County victim's advocate before 6:45 a.m. The advocate's call notes record one line from the family's response. It says, "They had stopped sleeping at night. They could start sleeping now." Task force agents conducted a rapid walkthrough of the root cellar after the suspect was secured. What they cataloged in that initial pass took less than 15 minutes. The 6 women had been sustained at a basic level. There was water. There were rations. The ventilation ran. But the space was 14 feet by 18 feet, with a ceiling of 6 feet 4 inches, and there were 6 of them, and some had been there for weeks, and the concrete held the cold even in January, and the lanterns had been off. The formal interview process for the 6 victims began at Marion County Regional Medical Center and continued over 3 days, conducted jointly by Marshals Task Force investigators and a specialist victim interviewer contracted through the FBI's Crimes Against Children and Victim Exploitation Unit. The interviews were conducted individually, at each woman's own pace, with medical staff present throughout. The interviews are sealed in the federal case record, but investigators who were present for portions of the interviews have described the emerging picture as one of methodical, premeditated operation. The women had been approached under different circumstances. Some had been offered assistance. One had been stopped near her car in a parking structure with a story about a lost dog. The details varied. The outcome was the same each time. What the interviews established was that the suspect had been specific about what he said to each woman in the moments before they lost the ability to resist. That suggested practice. What the task force had documented was not the beginning of a pattern, but a phase of one. That determination went directly into the investigative summary and into requests for additional resources and broader geographic analysis. The investigation began formally on October 9, 2025, when a task force analyst in the Tampa office named Deputy Lorraine Beaumont was cross-referencing open missing persons reports from a 4-county area of north-central Florida. Beaumont worked fugitive intelligence. She pulled the missing persons data as a collateral check on a separate inquiry, a search for a man who had jumped federal supervision earlier that summer in Alachua County. The man she was looking for was not the man she found. What she found instead was a pattern that took her 2 days to verify and then 2 more days to convince herself she was seeing correctly. 3 women, reported missing from different counties, in a span of 6 weeks, with no apparent connection between them. That alone was not extraordinary. The overlap of 6 weeks across 3 counties was not, on its face, alarming. The anomaly was the circumstances. Each of the 3 women had been reported missing in the pre-dawn hours. Each report noted a vehicle described as a dark-colored pickup truck seen near the last known location. 2 of the 3 reports mentioned the truck had Florida plates, but gave only partial numbers. Each report contained a notation that had been made by the initial reporting officer and then apparently not followed up on. The notation said the victim's cell phone had been recovered at the scene. All 3. Every time. The phone left behind. 3 women. 3 pre-dawn disappearances. 3 phones left at the scene. Each phone recovered. None showing evidence of a struggle with the phone itself. No cracked screen, no damaged casing. Just placed. Left. As though the person leaving them understood that a cell phone is the first thing investigators reach for. That is not panic behavior. That is not opportunistic behavior. That is procedural behavior. Beaumont flagged it to her supervisor on October 14th. Her supervisor kicked it to the Multi-Agency Missing Persons Coordination Desk on October 17th. The coordination desk assigned it to the Southeastern Regional Fugitive Task Force on October 21st as a potential abduction pattern warranting surveillance resources. The task force had 11 weeks between that referral and the morning of the breach. The first 6 weeks produced almost nothing. The partial plate numbers from the 2 reports were not sufficient to generate a definitive vehicle match. The cell phones had been processed by the originating county sheriff's offices and showed no useful data. Each had been powered off remotely within minutes of being left behind. The towers confirmed the devices had gone dark within a 1-mile radius of the abduction locations. That told investigators the phones had been shut down deliberately, and almost certainly by the same person who left them there. 3 weeks of surveillance on known associates and locations connected to the fugitive Beaumont had originally been tracking produced 2 interviews and no leads. The fugitive, who Task Force Supervisor Solis believed might have had knowledge of the pattern, was located in Georgia in mid-November and was found to be unconnected to the missing persons cases. That was obstacle 1 in an investigation full of them. Beaumont had been spending nights going back through the case files, looking for what she was missing. The court transcript records, supplementary investigative files, surveillance logs, she was reading everything. And it was in the original missing persons report for the Lake City case, filed on October 3, 2025, that she found it. A footnote. A procedural one. A notation added by the reporting deputy 3 days after the initial report, documenting a follow-up interview with a neighbor. The neighbor had seen the truck more than once. Not just on the night of the disappearance. She had seen it twice before, parked down the street, engine off, in the early morning hours. The first time she noticed it was because her own dog had barked at it. The second time it was in the same spot. The neighbor had not thought to mention this in the original report. She did not think it was relevant. Nobody had asked her specifically about prior sightings. The note sat in the file for 5 weeks without anyone connecting it to a pattern. When Beaumont saw it, she pulled every supplementary report from all 3 original cases and looked for similar notations. She found one in the Gainesville case file. A gas station 2 blocks from the victim's apartment had a camera that had been checked in the initial days of the investigation. The original detective had reviewed the footage for the night of the disappearance and noted nothing relevant. But the notation also said the camera's archive went back 30 days, and the detective had checked only one night. Beaumont requested the full 30-day archive on November 19th. It took 11 days to arrive. The truck appeared on the archive footage on 4 separate occasions across a 22-day window before the disappearance. Always between 3 and 5 a.m. Always parked. Always the same spot, 2 blocks from the apartment building. On the 4th appearance, the night of the disappearance, it was there and then it was not. The camera did not capture the victim. But the truck was there, and then it was gone, and the victim was missing by 6 a.m. The plate on the gas station footage was partially obscured, but it was not as obscured as the plates from the other reports. Marshall's forensic imaging analysts enhanced the frame on December 3rd. They got 5 of 7 characters. 5 of 7 was enough to generate a candidate list of 43 Florida registered vehicles matching that body style and those 5 characters. Beaumont and 2 task force colleagues spent 4 days cross-referencing against purchase records, registration histories, and prior law enforcement contact. By December 9th, the list was down to 7 vehicles. By December 12th, it was down to 1. A dark blue Ford F-250, extended cab, registered to a property holding company whose listed address was a mail drop in Gainesville. The company had been incorporated in September of 2025. It had no other registered vehicles. It had no business filings. It existed, on paper, to hold 1 truck. The task force flagged the vehicle in the National Crime Information Center on December 14th. They added the task force pager number. They added the notation, "Do not approach, do not stop, notify immediately." And then they waited. The days that followed the flag were not passive days, even though the vehicle produced no hits. Beaumont had continued pulling records, and by the 3rd week of December, she had built a comprehensive financial timeline for the holding company that registered the truck. The company had a checking account at a regional bank in Tampa. The account showed regular small withdrawals, cash, consistent with supply purchases, hardware stores, a plumbing supply distributor, a company that sold industrial ventilation components. The purchases clustered in a 6-week window between late July and early September of 2025. Before the first reported disappearance. Well before. She cross-referenced the addresses of the purchases against the task force's existing property inventory. The ventilation components, 2 orders, totaling over $1,200, had been shipped to a freight forwarding address in Ocala. The freight forwarder served dozens of customers. But the account that had paid for the shipment was traceable. It took 4 days and a subpoena to the freight forwarder to get the receiving name and address. The name was another company. The address was a post office box in Bellevue. Beaumont added it to the property map on December 21st and flagged it to Solis as a Tier 2 location of interest. Solis assigned a task force analyst to begin aerial review scheduling. That is how the January 19th and January 24th drone passes over the Ocklawaha property came to happen. The property had been identified through 4 months of records work, cross-referencing, and analytical patience. Here is the part of this case that generates genuine argument among the investigators who worked it. The flag went live on December 14th. The vehicle was not located in active surveillance until the night of January 26th, 2026, 43 days later. For 43 days, the task force had a flagged vehicle and no confirmed sighting. During that window, based on what was later established about the timeline, 3 more women went missing. The cases from Alabama were reported on December 29th and January 7th. The 4th Gainesville case was reported on January 17th. The flag existed. The vehicle was moving, and for 43 days it did not cross a camera or a checkpoint that triggered the alert. The system worked exactly as designed, and it was not designed well enough. A flag in the National Crime Information Center is passive. It requires the vehicle to be encountered. It does not find the vehicle. In a state with over 400,000 miles of public road, a vehicle that moves at night and avoids interstates can operate for months without a hit. The flag was the right tool, and it was insufficient. That is a structural failure that predates this case. The task force was not idle during those 43 days. They identified the property on the Ocklawaha through a combination of property record analysis and satellite imagery review. They found 2 other properties associated with the holding company that had incorporated the truck's registration. One was a storage unit in Marion County rented under a different company name but traceable through a shared bank account to the same individual. The second was the citrus packing property. 11 acres, abandoned structures, no active utilities according to public records. That last point was wrong. The property had power. It was drawing electricity through a meter registered under yet another company name. The account was current. The bills were modest, consistent with minimal lighting and ventilation equipment. Nobody had been looking. The task force surveilled the property by air on January 19th and January 24th. Both passes showed no vehicles, no visible human activity. The structure appeared abandoned. They noted it as a possible location, but assessed it as low probability given the lack of activity. They were looking at it wrong. The absence of activity at midday was not evidence of absence. It was evidence of discipline. When Deputy Holloway ran the plate at 4:11 a.m. on January 27, 2026, and the flag hit, and the pager activated at 4:26, and the truck drove 40 miles east on a route that ended at that property, every piece that the task force had assembled over 11 weeks collapsed into a single morning. The suspect, identified in court documents under the designation John Doe, pending formal proceedings, was taken into custody inside the front room of the building at 6:03 a.m. He offered no resistance. He was seated on the cot with his back to the wall when the entry team came through the door. The federal complaint filed in the Middle District of Florida that afternoon charged him with multiple counts under federal statutes governing unlawful restraint and related offenses. The document runs 41 pages. It names 6 victims by initials only. A bail hearing was scheduled. He was remanded without bail. Following arrest, Solis requested that the initial custodial interview be handled by the task force's senior interrogation coordinator rather than the arresting agents. That coordinator, a deputy with 18 years of experience in fugitive and organized crime cases, conducted a 40-minute interview before the suspect invoked counsel. The content of that interview is under seal. What Solis recorded in her notes is only this: he was precise. That is her word. Precise. Not evasive, not emotional, not cooperative. Precise. As though he had anticipated the questions and had calibrated the answers in advance. She wrote that it was unlike any post-arrest demeanor she had encountered in her career. That observation became relevant later when investigators began reviewing his conduct history and realized the discipline that characterized his driving behavior had characterized everything else as well. After transport to the federal detention facility in Tampa, a second interview was attempted the following day through his appointed counsel. The attorney declined on her client's behalf. All subsequent contact has been through legal filings. The Lake City woman had been in that root cellar for 40 days. The youngest victim, 22 years old, a licensed practical nurse from Gainesville, had been reported missing January 15th. She had been in the cellar for 12 days. Her parents had driven to Gainesville from their home in central Georgia within hours of the missing persons report and had not left the area since. They were contacted at 6:49 a.m. on January 27th. Before 7 a.m., the woman from Anniston, Alabama, 26 years old, had been visiting a friend in Gainesville when she was reported missing on December 29th. She had been in federal custody at Marion County Regional for 7 hours before an investigator confirmed to her family in Alabama that she was alive. The family had received the initial call about a possible recovery, but nothing confirmed. They waited 7 hours. Before the women were transported from the scene, each had been given a thermal blanket by the paramedic teams in the tree line. EMS coordinator Varela asked each one a single question, not an investigative question, a medical one. Can you walk unassisted? 5 of the 6 said yes. One said she wasn't sure, and she was placed on a gurney and walked to the transport vehicle. Varela later noted that the one who said she wasn't sure had also been the first to ask, very quietly, whether anyone had called her mother. She was 24 years old. She was from Tuscaloosa. Varela told her that someone would call her mother as soon as she was in the vehicle. The call was made at 6:22 a.m. These details do not appear in the federal complaint. They appear in the EMS incident report, which is a county document and not under seal. Most people will never read the EMS incident report. But the EMS incident report is where those moments live. Forensic teams entered the structure after the women were transported and the suspect was in custody. The root cellar was processed over 2 days. The false pantry wall was documented in detail. The Medico lock on the reinforced door was traced to a purchase in Tampa in August 2025, predating all 6 known disappearances. That timeline suggested a planning period. The ventilation system in the cellar had been installed by someone with working knowledge of HVAC installation. The work was competent. It was not improvised. The building had been selected, accessed, modified, and prepared before the first disappearance was reported. The holding company that owned the truck was traced through 3 layers of corporate registration to an individual in Hillsborough County. That individual was interviewed in late January and is listed in the federal complaint as a cooperating witness. The investigation is ongoing. There are aspects of the network, specifically the question of whether additional properties were identified and cleared, or whether additional properties remain unaccounted for, that the federal complaint does not address. The task force has not publicly resolved that question. One item recovered from the building has not been publicly explained. A ledger, handwritten, found in the chest freezer in the rear room inside a sealed plastic container. The entries in it run from August 2025 through January 2026. The entries use initials and dates and location codes. Investigators have said publicly only that the ledger is under analysis. They have not said what the location codes correspond to, or how many of them have been identified, or how many remain unresolved. The forensic processing of the root cellar took 31 hours across 2 days. The lead evidence technician, a Marshals forensic specialist based in Orlando, who had been flown in on the morning of the 27th, later filed a supplementary technical note. The note describes the state of the space in technical terms: distinct wear patterns on the floor, consistent with repetitive movement in a confined area, degraded battery lanterns consistent with extended use, and layering of biological trace evidence consistent with multi-occupant habitation over weeks to months. The note also records that the ventilation pipes, while functional, were not designed for the volume of occupants they were serving. The flow rate was calculated at slightly below the minimum recommended for 6 individuals. It was enough. It was not comfortable. The distinction between those 2 things is not small. The Amber Alert that started the night, the call that brought Deputy Holloway to Palmetto Creek Road before 4 a.m., was resolved separately. A minor had been reported taken from a residence during a domestic dispute. The suspect in that case, unconnected to the task force inquiry, was stopped at a roadside checkpoint on State Road 27 at 5:15 a.m. The child was recovered unharmed and returned to family before the Farmhouse breach began. That case was handled by Marion County Sheriff's Office. The 2 events happened in the same county on the same morning and were, except for the coincidence of timing and the plate check that connected them, entirely unrelated. Except that they were not entirely unrelated. The plate check happened because Holloway was already on Palmetto Creek Road because of the Amber Alert call. If the Amber Alert had come from a different neighborhood, or if Holloway had responded to a different call that night, or if the neighbor who described the truck had given a plate at all. Any of those variables changed, and the flag goes unread until some other morning. The task force had the flag in the system for 43 days. They had the property identified. They had the thermal survey protocol ready to deploy. Everything was assembled. It needed one deputy at 4:11 a.m. to type in one plate. How close things came to going differently is the part of this case that the federal complaint does not address, and probably cannot. The system's functioning is documented. The system's near failure is not. The 43 days the flag sat without a hit, while the ledger in the chest freezer accumulated entries, that is not in the court record. The case is moving through the Middle District of Florida Federal Court. A trial date has not been set. The Hillsborough County cooperating witness remains under the terms of a proffer agreement. The location codes in the ledger are still being analyzed. The 6 women recovered from the root cellar under a citrus packing house in the Ocklawaha Basin are receiving ongoing support through the U.S. Attorney's Victim Witness Assistance Program. Their names are not public record. Their families have been asked by prosecutors not to speak to media during proceedings. The nurse from Gainesville was 22 years old. She has not returned to work yet. The woman from Lake City was in that cellar for 40 days. 40 days is 1,000 hours. It is the kind of number that does not compress into a case file or a federal complaint or a court date. It sits there, specific and concrete, and not reducible to anything smaller. The investigation is ongoing. How many entries in that ledger remain unresolved has not been confirmed. Some questions in cases like this one get answered in court. Some get answered years later in appellate filings and civil proceedings. Some remain in the case file with no resolution notation next to them. The task force is